I love ancient Egypt, and I mean love it. I love it so much that I wore out Egyptology by de Gaulle's Steer until the little envelopes would be gone from this world, the pop-up panels were ripping off from wear and tear, and the book was in complete disrepair. I'd also carry around amulets of protection around school, and have that really cool novelty Egyptian bracelet things that no one really liked, but I really liked them because they look like really cool bangles. Oh yeah, I was very popular. Anyway, welcome to WILAE, a show where I explain all the many reasons why ancient Egypt is really, really cool. Today, we're talking about mummies. No, not that kind. Mummies. No, not that either. I mean these mummies. There's a vast history to the mummification process, many involving naturally made mummies and man-made preservation methods, and just random discoveries, or weird things put in wills. But we don't have all day for you to hear me ramble on about the history of it all, so here are the highlights. First off, I would like to apologise for any bad pronunciation. I struggle with my speech a lot anyway, and some of these names are rather new to me. So first off, decades ago, hundreds of naturally mummified bodies were found buried in boats in this barren desert in northwest China. They're dated to around 2100 to 1700 BC. The mummies' clothes and burial goods actually led some scholars to believe that they were migrants from West Asia. However, there's been DNA strands to show that they were actually part of the Tarim Basin mummies. Now, the Tarim Basin mummies from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China are the oldest human remains found in that region. That's so cool. It's been found that the extreme dryness in the soil in the environment that they were just resting in allowed their bodies to be naturally mummified. Isn't that fucking cool? Tell you what, while we're in China, I'm going to tell you about one of my favourite mummies of all time. In 1972, an amazing discovery was made in the form of Lady Di. Lady Di, or Xing Shui to her friends, died between 168 and 169 BC. Now I know, she looks a little bit fucked up. However, what the picture doesn't show you is that her skin is still soft to touch. Her arms and legs can still bend. She shows no sign of rigor mortis. Her organs are still intact, and there's still traces of blood in her veins. How fucking cool is that? She's actually so well preserved that doctors were able to give her an autopsy more than 2,100 years after her death. The autopsy was actually so successful that not only could they reconstruct her life and death, but we found out her blood type was A, making it the most complete medical profile ever on an ancient person. Which is so awesome! Imagine having your body that well preserved that scholars way in the future could actually just reconstruct your life and death. Xing Shui was wrapped in 20 layers of silk, and she was in 4 coffins of decreasing size, which I think is actually quite a nice link to ancient Egyptian methods. But that's just me and my biased brain. Lady Di now rests in the Hunan Provincial Museum, where you can still visit her to this day. They have her mummy and they have her whole reconstructed self. Oh, also, they found out her cause of death was obesity, because my god, that woman lived an amazing life. If this wasn't just about ancient Egypt, I might have rambled about her for a bit longer. Let's stay in Asia just a little bit longer and focus on Kobo Daishi, and Japan's Soko Shinbutsu, better known as the living mummies of Buddhism. First off on Kobo. In the 11th century, a hagiography gave the plot twist that Kobo's death in 835 actually didn't happen. NANI? The dude just crawled into his tomb and entered Nyojo, effectively becoming a living monk. He meditated so intensely that it suspended his very animation as a human. So cool! On to Soko Shinbutsu. Between 1081 and 1903, at least 17 monks managed to emulate this process and mummify themselves as well. This was done by limiting their diet to nuts, buds and roots from trees for 1,000 days to both toughen their spirits and distance themselves from the human realm, whilst aiming for immortality via rebirth. which is also a pretty nice link to ancient Egyptian pharaohs, I must say. This cycle would be repeated a couple of times until the final cycle wherein limited sanitized water would be drank for 100 days, allowing the body to completely dry up and complete the process. This was actually referenced in a Junji Ito story written in 1990 called The Unbearable Maze, which is fantastically written and I highly recommend it, but for the love of God, please do not watch the anime adaptation. Jesus Christ. Okay. Enough Asia. On to New Zealand for our very last stop. In 1815, there were papers that contained references to mummification in Maori culture. It was later found that the bodies were mummified so that they could be transported over long distances when they died. In the early 19th century, tattooed, decapitated and dried Maori heads unfortunately became quite the collector's item. It began with trades in 1770 led by Joseph Banks, who travelled with James Cook, whose only bad mark on history is this weird head collecting business. It was quite interesting looking into a guy who travelled the world back then and, didn't pillage and grape and murder people to death. Thankfully though, during the 2010s, these heads were returned to their rightful home. I wish I could tell you more about them, but every time I tried researching them, that's all I could find. So if any of you have anything about these Maori heads, I would love to learn more because they're so interesting. There is obviously way more to the history of mummification, both natural and unnatural, but we would be here for so long, we'd all be mummies ourselves. Finally, onto the task at hand. Ancient Egypt, the good stuff. Ancient Egyptians believed that a person's soul was made up of 3 different parts. There was the ka, which is one's astral self, shifters, listen up, which is created the moment you're born. There's the ba, which is a soul that can travel between the land of the dead and the living, and the ba would actually hover over the corpse after death. And the ark, which is the immortal self, which was this magical union of the ba and the ka. This might be why this period of history had such intense beliefs of immortality in the soul in general. It's estimated that at about 2600 BC that the Egyptians probably began mummifying the dead intentionally. Mummification in 2400 BC was an exclusive practice for pharaohs so that they were given an easier journey into the afterlife. All was good in the land. Tombs were becoming more sophisticated, Giza was becoming one of the 8 wonders of the world, and death was becoming a rather prolific business. Hey, what if we made mummification public? And with that thought process, by around 2000 BC, if you had the dosh, you could get an easier ride into a happy and illustrious afterlife as long as you were mummified. It should be known that in ancient Egypt, you could probably get into heaven anyway, but being mummified definitely helped the rather difficult journey. It was by the 3rd intermediate period in 1070 to 712 BC wherein mummification was at its peak and a truly refined process, which was soon followed up with Herodotus documenting the process of mummification at about 450 BC. Now, I have intentionally missed something pretty important to the history of ancient Egypt and mummification: the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead was actually developed from spells inscribed on scarabs and coffins from around 1650 BC. By the time of the New Kingdom, from around 1550 to 1069 BC, scribes actually began writing the spells on papyrus scrolls. So, small plot twist coming up, the Book of the Dead was never actually a book. It was actually a series of nearly 200 funerary spells. It was seen as a large status symbol to have because, much like mummification, these spells were not cheap. We've actually only found people who are evidently part of the elite to have a copy of the book in their tombs. A person could purchase their own version of the book once a priest knew their budgets and what their needs were for the afterlife. One of the most iconic spells being number 125, Osiris and the Judgment of the Dead. This is where the deceased would first approach Osiris and then the 42 other gods, then recite all 42 names, then make a negative confession, such as, "I've not stolen from anyone." You'd then get judged on your worthiness and purity against a feather of Marat, to then be let into the afterlife. Fun fact, there's evidence depicting the influence of ancient Egypt's belief of death in Christianity. Okay, it's time to get a little real with it, the process of mummification in Egypt. If you're a little squeamish with graphic content and or the more gory side of life, skip to this point of the video when I'm over talking about all this. So first off, all internal organs would be removed apart from the heart. This was because the heart was seen as the centre of intelligence and feeling. All the internal organs were removed except for the heart and placed in different canopic jars, depicting the four sons of Horus. Hapi held the lungs, Imseti held the liver, Duamutef held the stomach, and Quebisenef held the intestines. I have already apologised for some dodgy pronunciations, right? The brain would be essentially pulled out with this long hook through the nostril. Then some melted resins would be poured through the nostrils back into the skull, and then they'd roll around the person's head so that the empty skull was coated in order to stop some bacterial growth. And it also helped the skull with decomposition in general. The brain was only given this treatment because ancient Egyptians never actually saw the brain as essential, and honestly, I think geriatrics would be inclined to agree. After that, salt would be rubbed onto the body and left for about 40 days to get rid of all the moisture. Then, perfumed oils and thick layers of resin would be rubbed onto the body to both protect the body and act as a glue for the linen. The body was then wrapped up in linen and placed on a wooden board with more wraps placed around it. The body would have various amulets and iconography from the Book of the Dead, if the person could afford it, covering it as a form of protection and as an easier way to travel into the afterlife. Cooking onions or linen pads would actually replace the person's eyes. Now, most of you probably already know this fact because of horrible histories, just don't watch past season 4. Anyway, these long linen straps would cover the body a third time to keep those amulets in place, along with a depiction of the person's face to cover the head. It was during the Greco-Roman period. This would be a slab of marble, stones or wood, depending on how much you wanted to flex in the afterlife. Or if you were buried during 281 to 30 BC, you'd receive a full-blown mummy mask covering your entire torso. Or you'd get one of those fancy-ass good masks you see on pharaohs. And after all that hullabaloo, the bodies would finally receive their most famous layer in the form of the sarcophagus. Hieroglyphs would depict rebirth and protection, which would include the person's name so that it could be carried on for the gods so that they could be identified. This would be applied via paint made from materials gathered from Mother Earth herself. And boom! Mummification was complete! No wonder that shit took 70 days. Woof! Whilst in the tomb, treasures and models of willing slaves called Shabatis would assist the soul in their journey. But we'll talk about that in another video about the contents of ancient Egyptian tombs. We're just on about mummification here. Before we come to the conclusion and I let you go, I do have a couple of honourable mentions of specific mummies I found in my research for this video. I'd love to say they're ranked, but they are all equally awesome. Jeremy Bentham actually requested that his body be preserved in this way in his will, which was made shortly before his death on June the 6th in 1832. Bentham gave his body to his friend Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith, which is one of the poshest names I've ever heard, instructing him and Bentham's executor to arrange for his dissection to benefit medical science, kind of like the people who, hopefully, signed up for Gunther von Hagen's Body World's Vital exhibit. Bentham's will also directed that, following the dissection, his skeleton and mummified head be dressed in his clothes and hat, positioned with his chair and staff, and to quote, "in the attitude in which I am sitting when engaged in thought," end quote, and placed within, quote again, "an appropriate box or case," end quote. He argued that the dissection would advance scientific knowledge and the display of his dressed up skeleton would replace paintings and statues of him. He's actually still on display at UCL, which crosses paths with students multiple times a day. Personally, I think he just wanted a piece of that immortality pie. Rosalia Lombardo quite tragically died of pneumonia caused by the Spanish flu just shy of her second birthday in 1920. Her father was so grief-stricken that he sought the aid of an embalmer and taxidermist to preserve his child. The embalmer, a renowned Sicilian professor of preservation named Alfredo Salafia, then mummified Rosalina Lombardo so perfectly that her internal organs are still intact a century later. People have claimed to see her open her eyes. However, this was debunked in 2009 by Italian paleopathologist and fun killer Dario Piombino Mascali, who said, "It's an optical illusion produced by the light that filters through the side windows, which during the day is subject to change." I think he should have just let people have their fun and let her have a pretty cool haunted legacy. Giaia Setimu was a member of the royal choir and sang for the pharaohs and temples on the Nile, and tragically died between the ages of 7 or 9, we're still not entirely sure. She was a singer of the interior in the temple for the god Amun, an elite role within the temple choir. Because of this, she received the same level of elaborate mummification that Egyptian royalty and elite families received. She was wrapped in painted bandages with her face covered with a delicate veil and hidden by a golden mask, and she had been placed in a gilded sarcophagus. Thanks to modern technology, scientists used a computerized tomography scanner to discover that she still had a full head of shoulder-length hair that fell on both sides of her head, and you could even see her adult teeth pushing through her gums to get rid of her milk teeth. It was also found that she was only 4 foot tall when she died, which actually made her too small for the sarcophagus given to her. That, ladies, gentlemen, and everything in between, is why the process and history of mummification is one of the reasons why I love ancient Egypt. Thank you so much for watching. Hit the like, hit a subscribe. At the time of recording, we're 1 away from 20 subscribers, and that'll be pretty sick to get there. And I'll see you all in the next episode. Bye!